That was a moment, I'm sure, Anderson, that you, your panel, me, my panel, and people around the country, that was a painful moment to watch. It was early on in the debate, and Audie, Caitlin, and Chris are here. It was very early on. Chris, it seemed from that moment, that was it.
I think it was even before that moment when he first started speaking, President Biden, and that the raspiness, the hoarseness in his voice, that was at 9/11. And, there were several minutes when Jake and Dana were setting the rules. So it's got to have been less than 10 minutes into the debate. And he totally lost his train of thought and ended up saying Medicare just out of the blue. We've heard so much from the other panel, their reactions to this. I think ever since, and I've had this conversation so often, that after the midterms, if Joe Biden, after a remarkably successful first 2 years and a remarkably successful midterm for a first-term president, had said, I'm the transitional president, and I'm moving on and sending it to another generation, but he was unwilling to do that, and Jill Biden was unwilling to do that, and ever since then we have been.
I'm just as you're saying that, I'm only interrupting you, Chris, because that is a watch party. That's live right now. Joe Biden is joining her at the watch party she was at in Atlanta. Obviously, a response that does not match what seems to be the broader response. They're cheering for him right there, as you can see. 4 more years.
Do we want to watch that, or?
No, we don't have to.
Okay, we're not. Anyway, I was just going to say that the two of them decided after November of 2022 that he was going to seek the presidency when there were so many people who thought he should have turned it over to a new generation. And this has been, quite frankly, a car accident in slow motion that we've seen over and building and questioning it. And, as has been pointed out, Joe Biden sought this debate at this remarkably early time because he knew he was losing and he needed to change the narrative. Yeah. And he did change the narrative. He sunk his campaign to that.
Well, and we're in the spin room right now. This is where the surrogates and allies of the campaign come to spin their candidates' respective performances, and it is going to be an immense challenge for Biden surrogates. We have Governor Gavin Newsom here and also Georgia Senator Raphael Warnock in the back of the room. There are Trump campaign aides in here as well. No reporters are talking to them. Every reporter in here has just swarmed the two Biden surrogates that are inside this room. And I think what I'm most struck by after listening to that entire performance and talking to the Biden campaign officials and covering President Biden myself his first 2 years in office was part of his closing statement there. He made no mention of abortion or Donald Trump's felony conviction. The two things that they have talked about the most, the fact that that is the biggest contrast between President Biden and former President Donald Trump, obviously the felony conviction, but also what they've done on reproductive rights and the fact that through the justices who helped overturn Roe versus Wade were put on the Supreme Court by former President Donald Trump. But on January 6th itself as an issue, Donald Trump lied about January 6th. He downplayed his own role, and he also claimed that police officers were ushering people in that day. They've testified they were actually overwhelmed and outnumbered, and that is why people were able to get into the Capitol that day. And President Biden, who delivered an address on the anniversary of January 6th and said that Donald Trump was holding a dagger to the throat of democracy, did not seize on that moment and did not take that.
So can I just for a moment, because we can hear him, and this is happening right now. So I just in this moment, he's at a watch party. They're cheering 4 more years. He's speaking. What I'm curious about, okay, is does he know how bad this was at this moment? He walked out to his aides. Does he know? And we can hear him a little bit on the mic.
If he doesn't know, that's more alarming than anything. He's not the first president who's had a really.
Since we can hear it, why don't we listen to a little bit of it? Okay.
Heading to North Carolina. All right. Thank you. I want to go home with you. Thank you.
All right, so there he is. Thank you. The rousing applause going to that party.
Okay, he wasn't a third that vibrant or vigorous inside the debate body.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, I think a lot of Americans saw Donald Trump they recognized tonight, right? His mannerisms, his quickness in his response, and as you talked about, lies and information that was incorrect. Unfortunately, they also saw a Joe Biden maybe they don't recognize. This is not the person who was quick on his feet or fast to parry or to respond quickly to misinformation, to respond quickly to lies.
He hasn't been that Joe Biden in a long time. This
Well,
was
I
the
mean, my comment
this
was
the
it-
culmination of a process.
Perhaps, but it also was stark. You know, before I went into this conversation, I thought about the idea of infirm versus unstable. And I think that Joe Biden did not do enough to mitigate the idea that he is infirm. And Donald Trump was able to mitigate looking unstable. When I think about how he talked about abortion, for instance, trying to show that he was not extreme in some way. I know people are pointing out his lies tonight. That is also something that Joe Biden was to be doing in a more effective way and did not. And so it's sort of hard to be here now and say, this is was said and that was said. Like, that's your job on the stage to also jump in quickly.
There
And
were
say,
also
"That's
moments
not
where the sentence would end, and there was maybe an attempt to have a back and forth between them. Obviously, because the mics, they weren't able to do that, and then there would be another question.
It wasn't
the
the
Biden
mics. You have to
campaign-
use your time effectively. And unfortunately, the president did not do that.
I'm going to pick up on that. I mean, there was a question asked about what are you going to do for blacks and which black voters, which is a constituency that Biden is in terrible jeopardy of losing. He finishes his statement, and the moderator, I forget which one, says you have 49 seconds left. Basically, almost half of your 2 minutes. Then he's asked about Social Security, and I think it was Dana says, you have 82 seconds left. I mean,
Yeah.
he wasn't able to even fill the 2-minute
And
time he was given
this-
where the other guys might go up to talk about black voters and protecting Social Security.
And not to, I don't speak on behalf of black voters, but that was a great example of an issue where both of them sounded just like wild. What is the policy? What is a black job and a black child care? It was like, what is happening? It was very similar to the end when they started going off about golf. Why? I mean, those are those moments where I think as a voter, you're just like, these are the options, and it
Child care
doesn't feel
costs
great.
is one of the number one concerns that you hear from parents in this country. Parents have to quit their jobs because it's less expensive for one person to not work instead of having to pay for childcare. Neither of them gave a substantive answer on that. They were both answering questions about very different topics. I mean, Chris and I turned to each other and said, this was a question about childcare costs.
A lot of clumsy kind of response.
But I'll note that the mics, and that was, the Biden campaign agreed to that. They wanted that because they were so frustrated by how that first debate in 2020 went on this issue. And you did see Biden not using his time effectively with those times where Trump was not answering the question. I mean, Trump was asked 3 times if he would accept the results of the 2024 election. Obviously a critical question as we find ourselves in a state where he sought to overturn the election results here and was indicted and had his mugshot taken about 3 miles from where we're sitting right now. And that was not a moment that became a point of focus. It was like watching a debate with someone who is not a convicted felon and is not also under all of these criminal charges. And I think that is a question of why President Biden himself, who brings it up in other moments, did not use it more effectively. They used it in the one moment where he brought up Stormy Daniels as
Right.
well. Donald Trump denied having sex with her in another surreal moment in this debate. I don't think that that's ever been uttered on a presidential debate stage. But it was something that you see President Biden talk more about from the White House or in front of donors
Even
and closed
Trump's
door
attempt
events.
to spin January 6th, I just thought, oh, here we are in one of the most bizarre moments, right? The idea that actually on January 6th, there was a lot of good things happening. And if you just think back to that time, it was just so sort of
But
a
how does
wild
this
way
happen?
to spin that. And again,
I thought it was a pretty
Biden's not,
effective way to spin that.
well, it would be less if the president could respond to it.
Right, yes.
But,
that's
Spinning
exactly
January
right.
6th.
But Chris, he goes through 6 days of preparation at Camp David,
More than that.
and they know the
It was
rules.
more than a week.
Okay, and so more than a week. They know the rules. He practices with the mics. He knows every one of these questions is coming. And yet he couldn't fill the time. Now, I just want to, let's see what the White House is saying. Sources close to the White House are saying he had a cold, wasn't feeling well. I mean, as you would expect, that came out early on in the debate. But what accounts for someone with so much experience doing so much
I
preparation
think-
and this
I
being
think,
the outcome?
Honestly, I think the question answers itself. He wasn't capable of doing any better than he did. He had
well,
all.
there's
he,
a
let me-
world
let me
where he
just- let me-
prepared to
let me
not
just-
go over the 2 minutes.
that he was incapable tonight on the biggest of stages that he saw. He in effect dictated, and with all of that preparation, he was incapable of doing better than he was. And you can't come back from that. You
He
can't be on a stage where tens of millions of Americans watched you and come up empty. And that's what he did tonight.
He almost seemed a bit nervous at the beginning, Audie.
we could read all kinds of things into the facial expressions and the utterances, but I think at the end of the day, we heard the partisan panel start to wistfully look in the air and talk about what if he wasn't on the ticket, and I think that kind of language and the kinds of things that you're going to see over the next 24 hours is really going to be the important conversation. This debate was early. Is it early enough for there to be some other discussion, more fulsome, taken more seriously? And we'll find that out.
And one of the questions I have is, who, if Joe and Jill Biden don't make that decision on their own, is there anybody in the party? Because, the party's system has been so weakened. There were a group of people that came to Richard Nixon in August of 1974 and said, you know what, you got to leave. You have 4 votes in the Senate, and you either resign or you're going to be removed from office. I'm not sure there's anybody with that kind of authority in the Democratic Party who could go to Joe Biden and say, it's time to say goodbye.
And they said that President Biden had a cold and that he was recovering from that. I mean, that came about 50 minutes into the debate after he had been on. Obviously, they're passing that on background to reporters who are tweeting it. Voters who are watching at home, millions of them who have never even considered having a Twitter account, are not going to see that. And it's not really going to help reassure voters, because we do live in this moment where President Obama had a really terrible first debate. His own aides will now admit it, that he came off and he wasn't prepared and he wasn't ready, and Mitt Romney surpassed him in that debate. What's different about this is that voters already had quite high concerns about President Biden's age. And this was a moment where they were hoping it would look more like the State of the Union address and how he came out there and how he dealt with the Republicans who were heckling him. Here in this debate, President Trump would give his answer and President Biden would come out and say, that's a lot of malarkey, that's a lot of foolishness. But he didn't have the same demeanor that he did in 2020, where he looked directly at the camera and said, it's not about this. It's about you at home who are having these moments. He wasn't smiling and laughing as much as he was in the first debate. It was a very different demeanor in how he handled Trump. Trump, on the other hand, was not even making eye contact. He wouldn't even look at President Biden or in his direction as he was trying to stick to the messaging, or he would redirect a question about a general of his resigning into Biden and Afghanistan. He was taking those moments.
Detours.
And that is something that the Trump campaign worked with Trump on privately. And I can tell you, obviously this is the Trump campaign. This is what they're saying. They could not be more thrilled with how tonight went and feel really good about it. And they were nervous going into this debate of how Donald Trump would do. And now they're walking out of it feeling pretty good.
Yeah, certainly maybe didn't expect even
somebody sent me an emoji from a top person in the Trump campaign, just 4 flames, 4 dumpster fire flames. Another one wrote train wreck. They couldn't feel better about it, and they should feel good about it.
All right.
It was a very good night. And the one thing I will say for Trump, and there's no question, he lied about a lot of stuff.
A lot.
But he also showed real discipline. And, one of the big questions you talked about, unstable versus unfirm, he was not unstable, and he was very controlled even in the lies, but he had discipline.
He called Biden a Manchurian candidate. He lied about late-term abortions and completely misrepresented what happened on January 6th as well.
Well, there were many things that were not true, but
it was not a repeat of
contrasting
2020.
with an unstable sort of perspective. All right, all stay with me for more reaction. Anderson, I know we've got